Good evening, everybody. Can you tell it's been 3 weeks, give or take, since we've done a live show? We're still figuring out all the things all over again. It's like a brand new learning curve, but we're back. It is April 27th, 2025. It's election eve in federal land. We're not going to talk that much. We're not going to talk that much about that because there's plenty to talk about in the land of Alberta politics. So we've got a little bit of catch up to do. Thanks for joining in to start with. I guess I'll start with that. It's probably going to be a long one tonight. We got a lot to cover. We're going to be talking about some of the Danielle Smith foibles. We're going to be talking about the folks that have come out against Danielle Smith and the UCP, some of them surprising, some of them very surprising given the history. We're going to be talking about, we're going to continue our ongoing segment, deep dive into the Athena Mensalopoulos lawsuit. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the government's response, and then we're going to have some fun, gross. We're going to make fun of some gross things that were said on the internet by Mr. David Parker. So we got a big show in store for tonight. So we're going to get right into it. And let's start with the revelations that literally came forward today, compliments of Matthew Black, where he revealed that the Post Media had done a FOIP of the Alberta Premier's office feedback on her PragerU trip appearances. And there's a couple things that are worth highlighting here, because again, in case you've forgotten or you're new to the show, hi, thanks for joining. But in case you've forgotten, PragerU is not a university, and on the very, very best of days, they are deeply problematic. From the Wikipedia entry page for PragerU, PragerU's videos contain misleading or factually incorrect information promoting creationism and climate change denial. Historians and political scientists have also criticized PragerU's videos for containing misleading or inaccurate claims about topics such as slavery and racism in the United States, immigration, and the history of fascism. PragerU has been accused of promoting fascism, racism, sexism, and anti-LGBT policies. And if you're unfamiliar, Danielle Smith decided that she wanted to go hang out with her idealized bestie, Ben Shapiro, and do the PragerU podcast. We pulled a bunch of video clips. You can go back a couple episodes and you can find that there. And it was a mess. Danielle Smith couldn't even represent her own policies, let alone, some might say, effectively represent the province of Alberta. She literally described her own policies wrong. It's so hard when you go off script. But the whole thing was also funded by taxpayers. So she went down to do a fundraiser for this PragerU YouTube channel podcast. They raised over $1 million by most reports. And Ben Shapiro was going to come and he was going to say Ben Shapiro things. It was a very short little fireside chat. It was like less than half an hour. I think it was like 25 minutes. Could be wrong on that, but it was very short. I read the numbers and I was like, really? That's it? But she also went on the PragerU podcast, like I said, and taxpayers paid for everything. Not only did taxpayers pay for Danny to go down, but they paid for Danny's little entourage to go down as well. And it turns out Albertans had some feedback that they wanted to share. From the article, in a 20-hour stretch spanning parts of March 8th and 9th, Smith's office received 159 emails on the trip, or about one every 7.5 minutes on average, which were unanimously. And that's the key word here. The key word is unanimously. 159 emails unanimously opposed to the appearance, and mostly centered on the change dynamic between the US and Canada due to Trump's tariffs. It's not very often that you get 159 Albertans to agree on, anything really. But for this 20-hour stretch, 159 Albertans all agreed that this PragerU trip was not great use of taxpayers' money, especially given the new deficit. Moving on from there, we got a couple of updates that we got to talk about in regards to Grassy Mountain. So, spoiler alert. I spent myself and one of the team members from the breakdown spent the weekend down in the Crow's Nest Pass area, getting tours from locals, having some conversations with some folks. We shot a whole lot of video, and we learned some breathtakingly stupid things. Just truly whatever it is that you think that you know about Grassy Mountain that's made you go, oh, that's so dumb. Wait till you see what we have in store for you. So we're going to be doing a little segment that we're going to be putting together over the next couple of weeks for the Grassy Mountain piece. But there are other relevant updates. Now, to make some sense of these updates and provide a little bit of context, we're going to do a little bit of a rundown of the timeline of things so far. It's going to be very broad, but it's an important timeline to understand given the context of the story that we're going to update you on this week, which is not the breathtakingly stupid things. It's a little breathtakingly stupid, but trust me, what we're going to be sharing over the coming weeks is so breathtakingly stupid, it will take your breath away. But in order to understand what we're talking about tonight, we got to do a little bit of that timeline rundown. So in 1976, Alberta's initial coal policy was established. This is the coal policy where Alberta said, oh, you know what? The coal mining, it's not great. It turns out it's catastrophically bad for the environment in every instance that it's happened. So we're gonna make sure that if we do anything, it's not going to be in any environmentally sensitive areas. Fast forward to May of 2020, the UCP government under Jason Kennedy rescinded the 1976 coal policy, which led to, and this is where it gets to be important, increased coal leasing in previously restricted areas. So they lift the coal policy, and apparently they got a little bit of a heads up on it, that it might have been coming, maybe, allegedly, I don't know. But they lifted the coal policy, and there was a rush of coal companies, a lot of them not Canadian or Albertan, that stepped forward and said, we'd like to drill that, we would. And Albertans rightfully lost their minds, because when you take a look at the risks of coal mining in the Eastern Slopes and the fact that it literally affects all of the water for Southern Alberta and like Central Alberta for a good chunk too, and all of the industry that has anything to do with water, which is like all of it, and the historical track record of cleaning up coal mines is catastrophically bad, Albertans got very, very upset. So in February of 2021, the 1976 coal policy was reinstated due to public outcry. Now, this is really important because this speaks to the power of an entire province mobilizing and saying, oh, no, 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 no. And it also speaks to perhaps why the UCP under Danielle Smith have adopted their flood the zone with shit strategy, because it makes it very, very hard for Albertans to keep up on all of the different fires that the UCP is lighting. But in the meantime, and in between time, and in 2022, the moratorium on coal exploration in Eastern Slopes was implemented. So they said, we're not even going to do the exploration anymore. In 2023, 5 coal companies launched a $15 billion, that's with a B, dollar lawsuit against Alberta. They said that they were left with land that they couldn't use for what they bought it for, or land rights that they couldn't use for what they bought it for, after Alberta re-implemented its longstanding coal mining policy following that public backlash that I mentioned earlier. So 5 coal companies, they put all the money into their leases, and they said, you said we couldn't do the thing that we bought the land to do it for. Therefore, we're going to sue you for $15 billion. And this is where it gets complicated, because in the pursuit of that lawsuit, one of the things that the coal companies have said is that they would really very much like to speak to the then minister in charge of that stuff at the time, Sonia Savage. But Sonia Savage isn't in government anymore. They got an initial ruling saying, the government did, saying that neither had to testify, neither Sonia Savage or Jason Nixon. would have to testify in regards to this court case. But the Court of Appeal, the Alberta Court of Appeal, the coal companies went there and they said, hey, Alberta Court of Appeal, we don't like this decision. Would you consider giving us another one? And the Alberta Court of Appeal said, yes, we will. And so earlier this year, the Alberta Court of Appeal ruled that Savage needed to appear as she was best able to explain why things happened the way they did. So why did Alberta go from, yeah, we're not going to do coal there, to we're going to do all the coal, to no, we're not going to do any coal. That's what we're going to do. They want to hear why Sonia Savage led those decisions, if you will. Now, it's important to realize in January, December, we saw Brian Jean come out and make it very, very clear that there was going to be a whole new set of coal policies. They were going to be so good, so stringent. They were going to make sure that the environment was protected, except in certain circumstances.
How will this affect the Grassy Mine proposal?
Well, the Grassy mine proposal, of course, was an exempt mine going forward, but there are absolutely no exceptions in relation to selenium and the effect and the long ongoing scenario of selenium. And the AER is, of course, an arm's length independent regulator, and we're going to make sure that they will be dealing with all of the new mine applications as well as the existing ones. And
so the Grassy Mountain, they're exempt. They can do what they like, but they can't spill the selenium. That's not okay. Later on in that press conference, Rebecca Schultz was asked, how can you guarantee that there will be no selenium? And her response was, well, I can't guarantee much of anything, but we've got the AER, and they're really good at responding once the toothpaste is out of the tube and saying, oh, you should not have let the toothpaste out of the tube. Paraphrasing Rebecca a little bit there. But since then, the government has lifted the coal moratorium, and there has been commentary off and on from the Premier of Alberta, as well as some other ministers, that strongly suggests the whole reason why they lifted the moratorium was because lawsuits are apparently very scary when you're on the receiving end of them. It's worth remembering Daniel Smith and the UCP have launched multiple lawsuits towards the federal government. They have no problems filing the lawsuits, but when they're on the receiving end, they get very, very scared very, very quickly and roll over and say, "Oh, please don't hurt us." So that's what's going on with the Grassy Mountain piece. But the news this week is that the Supreme Court said, "Nah, the Alberta Court of Appeal, they got it right. We're going to leave it at that." Because the government then tried to turn around and say to the Supreme Court, oh, we don't like this decision by the Alberta Court of Appeal. Will you please consider listening to our arguments as to why Sonia Savage, the then minister responsible of all of these things, should not have to explain why she made these decisions, because they would probably be very, very embarrassing and possibly create some liability for us. We don't know. But we would like to not have to do the court thing with Sonia. So could you make that not happen? And the Supreme Court said, yeah, no, we're not gonna even hear the argument. So as it stands right now, the word is this week that Sonia Savage is going to have to testify as to why all of these changes were made in such a dynamic, I'm going to use the word dynamic there, manner. Moving on from there. And this is where it starts to get a little bit spicy, because now we get to talk about Pete Guthrie. And it gets pretty bonkers, because on it was February 25th, Pete Guthrie publicly released a letter wherein he said to his to the constituents of his constituency that earlier this morning I resigned my position as Alberta's Minister of Infrastructure. And he says everything's been great and I'm so proud and all of that. But where the rubber really meets the road, in recent months, I've voiced concerns regarding the government of Alberta's procurement practices across all departments. As Minister of Infrastructure, I had line of sight into these processes and took steps to address inconsistencies and recommended improvements as part of my fiduciary duty. This included introducing Bill 13 and proposing a financial oversight committee to review and advise on major government contracts. If implemented, such a committee would have been instrumental in preventing some of the issues we are now seeing in Alberta Health and AHS. Unfortunately, the majority of cabinet, so this is all the other ministers, does not appear to share my concerns. For this reason, I've decided to step down and return to caucus as a private member, still UCP member at the time, where I can continue to voice my concerns and hold cabinet accountable with honesty and integrity. It is essential that the public has confidence in the government and its processes. We're elected to be open, transparent, fiscally responsible, and above all, honest with Albertans. So it's not nothing for somebody to step down from a ministerial role. There's a big pay cut. There's a big resource cut. There's some, you don't get to go to as many cool meetings and other things. Maybe you don't get invited to other things quite as often. But as it turns out, that wasn't the only letter that Mr. Guthrie sent that day, because just a couple of weeks ago, he tabled this one in the Alberta legislature. And this was his letter to Danielle Smith. And this gets fascinating really quick. Over the past few weeks, I've raised concerns regarding GOA, Government of Alberta, procurement practices, particularly in the Department of Health. As Minister of Infrastructure, I've had line of sight into these processes and have had suggested steps, such as the implementation of a financial oversight committee, as well as delivering on Bill 13, the Real Property Governance Act, to minimize these issues. At Cabinet on Wednesday, it became clear that the Minister of Health, Adriana LaGrange at the time of this letter, and possibly even you, Premier, had knowledge of identified procurement issues involving Alberta Health and Alberta Health Services, yet you deliberately misled our reduced quorum Health Cabinet Committee on January 30th. This deception resulted in this dismissal of the AHS board. That would be, just for by way of context, that would be the same AHS board that allegedly told the former CEO of Alberta Health Services, you really need to talk to the RCMP about the things that you found. Continuing on. During that committee meeting, I expressed my concerns, requesting further disclosure, but none was forthcoming. Remarkably, during last Wednesday's meeting, the majority of ministers around the table, with the exception of Minister Jones, were satisfied that the practice of withholding pertinent decision-making details was justifiable and one which they could support. Due to this clear disconnect in our opinions around cabinet conduct, I can no longer serve executive council. This is not why we were elected. This is not what Albertans expect. And Premier, this is not why I supported you as leader. If we can normalize deception in government business practices, what other indiscretions may emerge? As such, I resign my post as Minister of Infrastructure. I will return to caucus and ensure cabinet is held to account with honesty in an honest and forthright manner. We owe this to Albertans, as this is the standard with which they expect. So those are two very, 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 very spicy little meatballs to throw down. And it wasn't long after that Pete Guthrie actually tabled a few other things. Well, it wasn't after the letter was written. So the letter was written, and then he tabled some things, and then he tabled the letter. But the letter was written at the same time as his resignation. He did a very, very interesting thing a couple of weeks ago.
Mr. Speaker, I have a number of documents for tabling, but to properly represent my constituents, I cannot be held in perpetuity to a suspension from caucus, which comes with a gag order. I am now at day 48 of my so-called 30-day suspension, impeding my democratic right to fully represent the people of Airdrie-Cochrane. Mr. Speaker, my first tabling is an article entitled "Government Tries to Deflect Auditor General to Lawyers. No Way," says Doug Wiley, by Don Braid, highlighting the muzzling of government officials. Braid states, "The procurement scandal is fast morphing into one of the most epic legal battles Alberta has ever seen." Mr. Speaker, this highlights some of the very reasons I resigned from Cabinet and why I called for a judicial review, cooperation with the RCMP, and our government's full support of the investigation of the Auditor General. My second tabling is an article from April 12th entitled "One Inquiry to Rule Them All," where the authors state the only way to achieve full transparency is through a judicial public inquiry, ensuring Albertans receive the truth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Now, when he tabled those news reports, he was still a UCP MLA. It didn't take very long, but 2 days, I think it was, maybe a day, before he was no longer made a UCP MLA. The UCP caucus expelled him. They kicked him out. He's no longer a UCP MLA. He's now an independent MLA. And if you thought him tabling the documents was a little bit on the spicy side, he had a lot more to bring to the table. Before we play the clip that we're talking about from August 17th, we want to play a clip from the same, literally right before Pete Guthrie got up to ask his questions. The NDP was asking some questions to the Premier of Alberta, which the Premier of Alberta, who was there at that time, answered.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the member for Airdrie Cochrane tabled his letter of resignation from Cabinet in this legislature, and it says, I quote, "It became clear that the Minister of Health and possibly even you, Premier, had knowledge of identified procurement issues involving Alberta Health and Alberta Health Services, yet you deliberately misled our reduced quorum Health Cabinet Committee on January 30th, end quote. Why would the former Minister of Infrastructure accuse the Premier of deliberately misleading her own Cabinet colleagues?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one was misled. The meeting in question was to talk about how we were going to stand up Acute Care Alberta, which came into effect on April the 1st, how we were going to wind down the Transition Board because it was no longer needed, and it was for the purpose of appointing an interim CEO, which we did.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The member for Airdrie Cochrane makes another important statement in his letter. He says that the Minister of Jobs, Economy and Trade also expressed concerns. The member for Airdrie Cochrane is specifically referring to the Premier deliberately withholding information from Cabinet. Wow. If true, this is incredibly concerning, shows very questionable practices by the Premier and government, and the public does deserve answers. Why were Cabinet ministers questioning the Premier about what she is and isn't telling them? Why does it sound like the same questions Albertans have about what she is and isn't telling them?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I note the date on the letter was February the 25th, and by February 25th, there's a number of things that we had learned from a statement of claim, from the statement of defence, from media reporting, and so we were all concerned about the need for us to get to the bottom of why it was that AHS was signing contracts with chartered surgical facilities that contain different prices for the same procedure at different facilities. And that's the entire reason why we have Judge Wyant looking into it, is the reason why we have the Auditor General looking into it, and this government is fully cooperating in handing over records, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The member for Airdrie Cochrane wrote in his letter, quote, "This is not why we were elected. This is not what Albertans expect." And, quote, "If we can normalize deception in government business practices, what other indiscretions may emerge?" End quote. Albertans did not elect a single member of this Assembly in order to deceive, Mr. Speaker. If the Premier's own Cabinet colleagues are worried about deception and indiscretions, Albertans are not getting the government they deserve. Will the Premier finally clear the air, do the right thing, the overdue thing, and call a full public inquiry?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one was deceived. We have discovered that there were different prices for different procedures at different facilities. That was not known when we made the decision to move to Acute Care Alberta April 1st, and that was not known when we made the decision to part ways with the AHS CEO. And so now we want to get to the bottom of why that is. In fact, Mr. Speaker, what we've discovered is that's a problem in other areas. We just went through a full review of childcare for the same reason, and that's part of the reason why we made the changes. You find problems.
Now, I know that was a long 3 minutes and change. Thank you for bearing with us on that. But there's a couple of pieces that I want to just kind of tease out of those, the Premier's responses there, because they have some truly fascinating implications. One of them is Smith said, yeah, you know what? we did find some irregularities. There were some things that we had some concerns about. There were surgical groups that were getting paid different rates than other surgical groups. That's a problem. We don't like that. Now, part of the subtext there is, as we've discussed on the show many times before, some of those rates were actually dictated by ministerial order. So to say we didn't know that we did the thing that made the thing happen is fascinating. But we'll get into some of that a little bit later. The other thing that's particularly interesting is Daniel Smith there in the legislature said that what they found was concerning enough that they have brought in a judge from out of province to take a look at the situation, figure out what's going on. There's some irregularities. We got a case. We need to solve it. So there's a little bit of smoke here. And there's an expression about where there's smoke, there's something else. The fact that the Auditor General has been looking into this stuff for quite a while, that adds a little bit more smoke to this whole situation with questions as to what is going on. These are all things that Smith is acknowledging. So Smith is saying, yeah, there was some weird stuff going on, and we are looking into it, because when you know there's a problem, you solve it, unless it means that you don't get to go to Florida to speak for a racist, allegedly racist online media outlet, in which case then you just go, obviously, because the taxpayers are paying for it anyways. But where it got really interesting is Mr. Guthrie followed up that section. Literally, the very next second that we're about to play is the very next second that occurred in the legislature. So, again, worth noting, the NDP, they're asking questions. Hey, Premier, what's the deal here? Daniel Smith stands up. What happens when Pete Guthrie asks his questions?
Mr. Speaker, I got to tell you, this is a little weird, but okay. It is well known that on January 30th, the Health Cabinet Committee met to discuss matters related to AHS and the board. Yesterday, I tabled my resignation letter in the House that referenced the fact that pertinent decision-making details were withheld from committee members. In my opinion, this lack of disclosure led to the dismissal of the AHS board. To the Premier, as a rule, do you feel that Cabinet, and caucus for that matter, should be provided with all materials necessary to make informed decisions?
The order. The Honourable Minister of Justice is the only one with the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Honourable Member for the question. The meeting was for the purposes of enabling the appointment of an interim CEO and an official administrator of AHS to support the transition of AHS into a hospital-based service provider and the standing up of acute care Alberta, Mr. Speaker. We've been clear about that. The Premier just spoke about that. That was the purpose of the meeting. That was the content that took place in the meeting, Mr. Speaker. There was no information withheld from the Cabinet Committee members relevant to this issue.
The Honourable Member for Airdrie Cochrane.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't step down because nothing happened. Given that during the reference meeting I expressed concerns about making quick decisions without all available information, and given my instinct under these conditions is to back off until more data comes to light, and given ministers have a responsibility to follow honest disclosure, and given my letter states you deliberately misled a reduced quorum Health Cabinet Committee on January 30th, to the Premier, describe the government policy which upholds transparency and accountability in Cabinet decision-making processes.
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite is misguided, misinformed, and misinterpreted the context of that meeting. The meeting was about making sure that we have a CEO, an interim CEO of Alberta Health Services that also could be an official administrator, because, Mr. Speaker, we're at the most critical stage of the refocusing where we in fact take Alberta Health Services to becoming a full-service acute care provider, not the be-all of and end-all of everything. Mr. Speaker, that's what we're doing.
The honourable member for Airdrie Cochrane.
Mr. Speaker, that couldn't be further from the truth. Given that during the January 30th Cabinet Committee meeting that resulted in the firing of the AHS board, there was no mention of a letter from the former CEO of AHS, no mention of the Auditor General's notification, nothing about an AHS commissioned report on Tylenol, and zero about an AHS investigation into surgical facilities. To the Premier, is withholding information from Cabinet considered normal course of business? Because I took the issue as seriously. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The Honourable Minister of Health has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the member opposite again has it incorrect. Mr. Speaker, the meeting was about what I had just previously stated in terms of making sure that we have a CEO who is also able to be an official administrator. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite talks about the former CEO of AHS. The former CEO of AHS was in fact let go for a number of reasons, as has been stipulated in the statement of defense.
There's so much going on there. And I'm going to take, before we get too far into the weeds on, excuse me, on that clip, I do have to offer a correction to Mr. Guthrie, the Honourable. Oh, he's still the Honourable because the honorific was made for keepsies by Jason Kenney. So I do have to stipulate a correction to the Honourable Mr. Guthrie. He in there referenced the government decision to purchase Tylenol. Tylenol is a brand name. The government of Alberta told AHS to purchase acetaminophen, and the purchase was a different dose than was mandated in the government directory. But regardless, it was a product that was delivered by Atabay Pharmaceuticals with the brand name Payroll. So if we're talking about Tylenol, it was not Tylenol. If only there was some sort of glib but clever way to summarize that. If only. So Mr. Guthrie is very, very clear there. And it's fascinating because we just saw Danielle Smith. She was just there. But, pardon me, she wasn't the one answering the questions. First, we got the little guy with the very, very red hair, the Justice Minister, who we're going to talk about next week. But the Justice Minister stood up and he used his very big boy voice, and he said, "That's not what happened." And then Adrienne LaGrange stood up in a very, almost sounded nervous, frustrated, didn't like being challenged kind of voice. I don't know. I'm just speculating. Where she said, no, the meeting was to ensure that we could have somebody fulfill the role of the board, because our number one priority is the refocusing. We have to transition AHS from being a health authority to just being a hospital provider. They're just going to be like a contractor. That's the number one thing that we have to do. And it's weird because if that was purely the sole reason, you would think that there would be some sort of indication from any of the board members that that was the plan all along, that they were always going to get rid of the board that they had just finished appointing not that long ago, in order to give one person consolidated command and control of the entire AHS operation. You'd think that there would be people who could speak to that, unless, of course, they'd been compelled to sign NDAs or non-disclosure agreements, and they could only speak outside of those non-disclosure agreements if they were being forced to testify. I'm just speculating on a bunch of different things here, but it's fascinating. That Danielle Smith at no point stood up to answer any of those questions that were directed not to the Minister of Justice, not to the Minister of Health, but to the Premier. It's almost as if Danielle Smith really, really doesn't like being questioned. That would sure be weird. Anyways, on April 23rd, Pete Guthrie wrote another letter to his constituents, remembering that the first one came out, and that was him saying, "Hey, everybody, I've stepped down as minister. Wanted you to hear it from me first." There's a couple of things in that letter, though, that are worth highlighting. They're probably worth not just his constituents, but all Albertans hearing. Regrettably, under Premier Smith, the UCP has morphed into a party with a number of objectives that I opposed internally and can no longer in good conscience support. Competent, honest governance has taken a backseat to political maneuverings that jeopardize the best interest of Albertans. In my opinion, key conservative principles are openness, transparency, good governance, and fiscal responsibility. Yet these ideals have been abandoned by the Premier in her handling of serious allegations facing, and he calls it the Department of Health. It should be the Health Ministry, but we're Americanizing everything in this province these days. Staff operating in a toxic environment fear sharing potentially critical information that could be vital to uncovering the truth. As the RCMP and the Auditor General investigate the case, the Premier staunchly refuses to be transparent and initiate a legal review, the very thing required to restore public confidence through formal legal judgment. I felt compelled to ask why she remains firm in this stance, which, in my view, cannot be defended or supported. He goes on to say, the government's commissioned investigation, led by an out-of-province judge with no legal authority in Alberta, is unlikely to earn public trust. Judge Wyant, no doubt a well-respected professional, is nevertheless limited by a narrow mandate designed to deflect criticism rather than uncovering the truth. I made it clear to caucus that this review resembles a classic whitewash report, seemingly designed to conceal wrongdoing rather than expose it, an approach that risks triggering serious allegations of a cover-up. Those allegations have already been levied by more than a few folks. He didn't say that, I did. The scope of the investigation is confined to reviewing legislation, regulations, and procurement policies within government agencies and lacks the mechanisms necessary to pursue accountability. Witnesses are not compelled to testify, and any information provided is tightly controlled by government officials. A number of key personnel and senior staff within Alberta Health Services have already been dismissed, further hampering the credibility of the inquiry. And then we get to the real shots fired. Finally, it appears the Premier may be using the federal election as an opportunity to raise her own national profile, possibly at the expense of the CPC and Pierre Poilievre's efforts to become Canada's next prime minister. Recent developments in her political agenda raise legitimate questions about her intentions for Alberta's role within the Canadian Federation, another area where I find myself at odds with her leadership. Whoa. I mean, it is election eve. And we did see Danielle Smith on the Breitbart podcast saying that she would just love it so very much if Donald Trump could just please cause the tariffs, because the tariffs are giving the Liberals and Mark Carney, boy, people are starting to like them when they're not busy hating Trudeau. And they see, and this was Danielle Smith's argument, that Mark Carney might be better suited to deal with Donald Trump. To push back, and maybe Pierre Poilievre's not the greatest person for that. So maybe if we could just pause the tariffs and take that pressure off, that sure would be great. Those aren't direct quotes, but that's the crux. We've played the video before. You can find it on our socials. You can listen to all of her comments yourself. But that was the crux of her argument. That argument then, by the way, after her PragerU appearance, was repeated almost verbatim by her new bestie, Ben Shapiro. So everybody and their dog was like, hey, we should pause the tariffs so that the Conservatives can win the election. But the Conservatives, any political party, for the record, speaking for myself now, any political party should be able to carry an election independent of what sort of foreign shenanigans are being levied. If you want to rule a country, if you want to be the government serving the people of a country, you have to be able to manage not only the things that are happening during an election, but the things that are going to happen with your up to 5-year tenure as government. And as we've seen in the last 10 years, a lot can happen in a couple of years. So if you're not able to articulate to the voters, to the electorate, that you are competent to handle all of the things that a country might face, that isn't Donald Trump's fault. That's yours. There's my election speech. But there's a couple of things that are really worth highlighting when we're talking about Pete Guthrie to really hammer home just how far, how serious this is. I mean, Pete Guthrie has some views. He has some thoughts on some things and some stuff. No question about that. But he's also one of the first people that endorsed Smith. He, by some accounts, sold a massive number of memberships that helped her secure the UCP leadership. He even produced this video in the run-up to the UCP leadership race, where he made it clear what he was taking away from Danielle Smith.
Hi, MLA Pete Guthrie here. As you know, we have a leadership contest underway at the UCP. As with any election, the candidate you choose is a personal decision, one that requires evaluation of the competitors' pros and cons. Right now, there are 10 contestants who have put their name forward, and each has their positive attributes and strengths, deserving consideration. It is not easy to put yourself out there, so I can certainly respect each of these individuals for their commitment. Now, over the course of the last year, I have been vocal with my opinions on various matters, and I am truly happy to see a new direction, led with enthusiasm from our members and constituents. With the ensuing leadership race, before I selected someone to support, I wanted to take my time and not just jump right in. I felt it was important to review the candidates, check out their platform ideas, see them perform in person and on social media, as well as at a forum or debate. And I've been doing just that. Like many, I'm looking for a leader who I feel aligns most with my values, who will best represent Albertans. Someone who is firm in their convictions and isn't afraid to stand by them. A leader who will truly stand up to Ottawa and keep the feds in their own lane. Someone that believes in efficient government. In my opinion, Danielle Smith is best suited for that role, and I am happy to lend my support to her campaign. We've been provided with an opportunity for a fresh start. With Danielle's experience and positive mindset, I feel she will be a real difference maker to inspire change in our party. So I would like to encourage everyone to go out and see the high quality candidates that we have running at the UCP and determine for yourself who you believe is best suited to lead us into the next election.
That's the guy that Danielle Smith wouldn't answer questions. That's the guy that Danielle Smith trotted out, her Minister of Justice and her Minister of Health, instead of answering her questions, his questions, herself. I mean, Pete Guthrie came out very early in support of Danielle Smith, and he very clearly believed he was getting something. He very clearly believed that Danielle Smith was bringing something to the table. And that belief, that faith has clearly been shattered. It has clearly been destroyed. It's clearly been wiped away because he stepped down from his ministerial role in Danielle Smith's government. He went ahead and continued to push for the things that he says he believes in, knowing full well that this is not a government that responds particularly well to constructive criticism, to contrarian voices, let's say. He knew what the risks were, but he still took them. And it's really important to highlight Pete Guthrie does not have a history of being a moderate. He doesn't have a history of being somebody who just sits in the background and doesn't do the things. He gets his hands dirty for better or for worse. He was one of the first MLAs, one of the first people to throw their support behind the early iteration of Take Back Alberta. This is a picture of him signing the Take Back Alberta RV. Pete Guthrie is a fairly hard right conservative. He spoke out against the vaccine, the health restrictions and the mandates that were put forward during the COVID pandemic. So this is not somebody who is all of a sudden changing sides. And there's been a little bit of narrative. There's been a little bit of discussion that all of a sudden Pete Guthrie is now going to like cross paths to the NDP or something. And I would be willing to bet all the money in my pockets that's not going to happen, because that's simply not who he is. That's not where his political bread gets buttered. But he's a member of Danielle Smith's former base. And as we're going to see a little bit later on in the show, she's hemorrhaging support from that base. And the danger of that is those are the active ones. Those are the ones who show up and they do all of the things. And that's why they get stuff done, because things getting done doesn't not happen because people just, I think we should do it, or that sounds like a good idea. They do it because people step up and they do the hard work of doing the things. Agree or disagree with them. I'd like to think that I've made my stance on David Parker and Take Back Alberta fairly clear, but I've never not once said that he is not an effective political operative, and he is, because he goes out there and he gets the things done. The things he does are gross. The things he says are horrifying. Like I said, we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail a little bit later on. But he does the things. That's the cloth, maybe different brand, but same kind of cloth that Pete Guthrie is cut from. And so his departure with all of these moves is a very big deal. And there's going to be a lot of people that try to minimize it. Certainly, there's going to be a lot of UCP MLAs and ministers that do their very, very best to try to minimize it. But there are some cracks that are starting to form, and it's critically important that Albertans are paying attention to those cracks, because those cracks can potentially, for people who hold differing ideologies, represent opportunities. And to fail to take firm hold of those opportunities would make them wasted opportunities. Moving on from there and continuing with the lighthearted fare, let's talk about measles. Because the measles situation in this province is rapidly getting very bad. As of April 25th, this was yesterday. This was published. Today is 2 days ago. 2 days ago, we had 129 cases of measles since the outbreaks began in March. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it's the most cases of measles that we've had in the province of Alberta since 1997. And that represents a whole bunch of other really big, different problems. 2 days ago, 129 cases. Before we came on to the air tonight, we took a look. It's already gone up since that story was published, 137. And that's as of end of day on April 25th. So by the time we get back to the next update on Monday, it is stunning to think of where the measles cases could be. And it's really important to understand that, I'm going to let an expert speak in a couple minutes, but measles is the most contagious disease known to man. So that's not great. I will say here and many times throughout the show, check your vaccination status. If you have only one dose, you should probably talk to your doctor. And if your kids don't have doses, you should probably talk to a competent doctor, because there can be some really horrifying consequences. And this gets us to the Chief Medical Officer of Health, because this has been a bit of a slow boiling story. There's been a lot of frustration that has been expressed by Albertans in regards to, hey, there's all this stuff going on. Healthcare is being dismantled, and there's all these things that are happening. Where's the CMOH? Why aren't we hearing from him? Why aren't we getting updates about the measles things? Why aren't we seeing proactive messaging, educational, science-based messaging for people? Why aren't we seeing these things happen? Well, there's a couple things that happened. On March 15th, it became known that Dr. Mark Joffrey, who is the interim Chief Medical Officer of Health for Alberta since November 15th, I think, 14th, 15th, we'll get to it in a sec, of 2022, had left the building. He's done. He was out. And this is where it gets so frustrating, because even the nature of Dr. Joffrey's departure, we don't have a clear picture on. Even this basic messaging as to why the Chief Medical Officer of Health left their role, the facts around why did the person leave the job, have proven to be too complex for this government to properly explain, which is absolutely bonkers. Let's hear from the Premier first.
The health minister was hoping that Dr. Mark Joffrey would accept an extension of his contract right up until it expired. It expired on April the 14th, and he chose to go on to other opportunities. He's done a great job for us through a number of different crises, whether it was E. coli or giving us advice on the most recent measles outbreak. We're in the process of interviewing candidates. We hope to be able to have an interim announcement for.
That's the Premier of Alberta. That is her standing up in the legislature saying, hey, everybody, we had really hoped that Dr. Mark Joffrey would accept an extension, that we would find a way to get him to hang out for a bit. That's what we were really hoping for. But he's decided to move on. His contract expired. And so what are you going to do? He's got other things that he wants to spend his time on. Okay. Let's start to sort through the bullshit, because from the CBC story, the Alberta government confirmed on Tuesday afternoon that Joffrey's contract ended on April 14th after being extended for an additional 2 weeks. So he did take an extension for 2 weeks, and that the search for a permanent replacement had begun. Since November of 2022, Dr. Mark Joffrey has served Albertans as the interim Chief Medical Officer of Health with dedication and professionalism, providing public health expertise during a time of significant challenges and transitions, a statement from the Health Minister's office said. So, he did take an extension, and his contract would have originally ended on, if he took it for 2 weeks, it would have ended at the end of March. But he took an extension for 2 weeks. But Daniel Smith said he didn't take an extension and that his contract expired. It's all very, very confusing. Hey, wonder what would happen if we went to the original announcement. Maybe we'd get some clarity there. It was an appointment from the original announcement of Dr. Joffrey's appointment. Dr. Joffrey's interim appointment takes effect November 14th and will continue until the Minister of Health rescinds the appointment. He will continue in his current contract with AHS with no additional compensation for the Chief Medical Officer of Health role. And you see where the confusion starts to creep in, because in the initial announcement from November of 2022, they said that it was effective on the 14th and that it was an appointment and that it would continue until the Minister of Health decided that we would rescind the appointment. There's no mention of a contract. In fact, they expressly go out of their way to say that, hey, there's not going to be an extra pay. He's just going to keep his contract with AHS and he's going to do this work instead. So what? There was a contract, but there wasn't a contract, and there was an agreed term, but there was no agreed term. It's very difficult to keep track of what's happening here. But there are maybe some clues, because on March 14th, Dr. Joffrey released a statement. Now, April 14th. March 14th, Dr. Joffrey released a statement where he said, Measles cases are increasing globally, with numerous countries and travel destinations reporting outbreaks. Cases have been identified in several Canadian provinces, including an outbreak recently identified in northern Alberta. He then goes on to speak about how measles is an extremely contagious disease and spreads easily through the air. People born or since 1970 who have had fewer than 2 doses of measles vaccine are susceptible to infection. So Dr. Jaffe is making it very, very clear there that, hey, there's this measles thing, and it's not great, and that's not great, and we should probably address that. That would be really, really good. And so that's okay. Sorry, that statement was April 11th. I knew I was getting something wrong there. So that statement that he released, where he sung the praises of vaccination and said that measles should be taken very, very seriously, was released on April 11th. And 3 days later, his contract that had been extended expired. And there's a lot of questions. We're going to get into some of them. But again, this goes back to when we're talking about a public health emergency, public health crisis, which measles definitely has the potential, if not already is, to fall into that category. One would think clarity of messaging. If we learn nothing from the pandemic, if we learn nothing from COVID, you have to be clear with people. You have to be honest with people. And for God's sakes, you have to be as accurate as possible with people as you can. One would think that the circumstances surrounding the departure of the chief medical officer of health during the largest measles outbreak in this century in the province of Alberta would be something that we could maybe execute on. But apparently, that's just a bridge too far, because we have the premier saying, we wanted to take an extension. He wouldn't take an extension. We have the health ministry saying, he took an extension, but then his contract expired because it expired at the beginning of this month, which is, again, baffling, because it's an appointment that had no determined end date. And even if it was a contract, what contract would start in the middle of a month and then end at the end of another? It's all just, none of it makes any sense. But there's maybe some other pieces we got to talk about. The first one is we have a new chief medical officer of health. So there was a new chief medical officer of health who is named Dr. Sunil Sukram. He's an emergency room physician. There's been some questions as to the depth and breadth of his experience in public health, but hopefully it's there and he picks up the ball and runs it. One positive thing, or perhaps if you're Daniel Smith and Daniel Smith's base, one negative thing, is Dr. Sukram back in 2021 was advocating for vaccine passports. 2021, October 2nd. We need a real vaccine passport in Alberta, one that can't be forged, one that is mandated everywhere. No healthcare workers should be unimmunized. No more excuses. Okay, well, that's dissonant with Daniel Smith's ethos. But what's happened since then? Well, one of the big things that's happened is Dr. Jaffe released an opinion piece. And I'm going to speculate here. I'm just going to throw it out to the ether. I have no factual basis for what I'm about to say. But it strikes me as somewhat strange that you have a chief medical officer of health who, during a measles outbreak, you see minimal statements from, given that he works for the government and any statements need to be approved by government. It's fascinating that you don't hear anything. And then all of a sudden on April 24th, 10 days after he leaves his role, he writes a massive article, a massive opinion piece that has huge uptake. People read this. People get excited about this because this is what so many people have wanted to see from somebody who's occupying that role, who's not being suppressed maybe by government. And he goes through it all. It's an amazing, amazing article. It's evidence-based. It's science-based. It's of the voice of an expert. It's huge. But it didn't come from government. It came from Dr. Mark Jaffe writing an opinion piece in the Calgary Herald. That's what it took. But where it gets really clear, where it becomes abundantly the subtext and the room for some dangerous, quite frankly, speculation plays in, is where Dr. Mark Joffe on April 25th, so just this Friday, he did a presentation on measles in Alberta at the University of Edmonton for their grand rounds. Now, that's where I'm going to oversimplify this. I'm probably going to get some messages, but basically what ground rounds are is where you have an expert, somebody who knows the things, come forward and speak about one of the things. And they say, here's what you need to know, my fellow physicians, about these things. They're a big deal in the medical world. They don't usually get much attention outside of it. But the presentation that Dr. Joffe did is one that probably every Albertan should be paying attention to. Pulling a couple of pieces out of the PowerPoint deck. For the record, this is a publicly available YouTube. It was posted as a publicly available YouTube, so we're not speaking out of turn. We're not taking anything that's not publicly available. This is one of the slides, and it really highlights the severity of the problem. We had a little bit of a bump of measles in 2013 and 2014, but as of the date of this chart, which was April 23rd, and by the time that Dr. Joffe did the presentation, we'd actually exceeded the 123 and become the worst measles outbreak in this century in Alberta. But where it becomes really clear where the problem is when we start to talk about MMR doses or the very, very safe vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella, 2 doses by age 2, the uptake of that vaccine. And the numbers on the screen, if you think the numbers on the screen here are bad, wait till I get to the next slide. 57.5%, 72.1%, 57.7%, 59.6%. For the province of Alberta, the overall vaccination rate is 69%. That is nowhere near what is required for what people refer to as herd immunity. And it's also important to realize that that is spread out over the entire province. You look at Calgary and Edmonton zones, 72.1%, 75% for Calgary, 72.1% for Edmonton. Those are not great numbers still, but the coverage that somebody's going to get in Calgary or Edmonton, the protection is way different than somebody who's going to be getting it in North Zone, where it's only 57.5%. But if that isn't horrifying enough, when they start to look at select counties, there is a county in Alberta where only 10% of kids by age 2 have 2 doses of MMR. There's another county that has 24%, and there's another county that has 25%. These are horrifying numbers. And these are numbers that exist because of misinformation and disinformation and outright lies. And you see that in a couple of the questions that Dr. Joffe took in the Q&A section of the Grand Rounds. The first question that he was asked is, what would you tell the government if they wanted to hear from you right now?
So if the government of Alberta actually wanted your opinion, what would you tell them to do today?
Well, I would tell them exactly what I've just said, and let me say, I have to be a little careful what I say about this, but we did have these conversations. We had these conversations a year ago. We had some one-off cases of measles. We knew what our immunization rates were, and we talked about the need to get some information out there. I mean, I think the first step is we need to be sure that Albertans actually understand what measles is and what we can do to prevent it. And it's not just measles, it's other vaccine-preventable diseases. But, MMR, has, unfortunately, because of Wakefield, has a special challenge with it. And so we need to get out, we need to explain, what is this disease? What are we trying to prevent? What is this vaccine? And we also need to do it in a way that people will understand, because we have large portions of our population who are not reading the government website. They're not following the social media tweets that our government is putting out. And we need to meet them and explain in their language and in a way that they can understand. And we need to work with faith leaders and community leaders, cultural leaders, who have big influence. These are the influencers. These are the original influencers. They have big influence on their population, on the communities that they work with. And, you know, I'm not aware of any culture or religion that actually promotes disease and death in children. So I think we need to be working with people so that they understand what we can do to help prevent this. Ultimately, we're not forcing people to be immunized, right? But they at least need the information. And in fact, I am aware of instances of individuals being hospitalized with measles where the family is completely unaware that this was preventable, completely unaware. I've never heard the word vaccine, maybe not in English at least, or in their language. They've never heard the word vaccine, have no idea that this is actually preventable.
That's heartbreaking. That's absolutely heartbreaking. And it's heartbreaking for a couple of different reasons. The very first thing that Dr. Joffe said there was that he had to be careful about what he said. Now, there's probably a lot of different reasons why he has to be careful about what he says. I mean, I imagine that he doesn't want to get things wrong. But a reasonable person could probably speculate that part of the reason why he has to be careful about what he said is because maybe, I don't know, maybe there's an NDA somewhere. Maybe there's a non-disclosure agreement somewhere. Maybe he's limited about how much he can talk about what happened while he was in his role. Maybe there are still legal shackles that are applied to the former chief medical officer of health. I don't know, but a reasonable person could speculate. He references Andrew Wakefield, who is a liar. He fabricated a report that he was paid to produce. And that is where all of the bullshit beliefs came from, that vaccines cause autism. And in the full YouTube clip, which I would highly recommend, anybody who's got an hour to kill, it's so worth watching because he spells it out so clearly and so concisely and with evidence how much harm the misinformation and disinformation that exists around vaccination has caused, which makes it very, very clear. Dr. Joffe has a very clear understanding of the importance of communication. He talks about meeting people where they are. He talks about making sure that you're engaging the right people. He's referring to all of the lessons that most experts have brought forward coming out of the COVID pandemic. And he's saying these are the things that we should be doing. So a reasonable person could probably, in the absence of all other evidence, speculate that maybe the reason why he has to be careful is because there's an NDA. Maybe there's maybe the reason why that communication that is so desperately needed to address this measles outbreak, the measles outbreaks that are occurring across the province and address the vaccination rates are because the government doesn't want that to happen. A reasonable person could very easily speculate that. A reasonable person could also very easily speculate that maybe part of the reasons why the circumstances under Dr. Joffe's departure are so conflicting is not because of Dr. Joffe, but rather because this government can't find the truth to save theirs or anybody else's lives. But there is a second part to that answer.
So we need, for sure, advocacy, publicity. We need to make sure that there's access to vaccine, however that is, whether it's local public health clinics. Of course, they're being overwhelmed. Do we need to set up mass immunization clinics? I will say each of the 5 AHS zones, starting a year ago, did a lot of preparation to plan for measles. So they worked, you know, if you're in the central zone, for example, where exactly would you put a mass vaccine clinic? So, I mean, there are some logistical challenges. Ultimately, we need to ensure access. I can tell you immunization rates in the far north where we had an outbreak were poor, but that's because those communities were evacuated 3 times for wildfires in the last couple of years, and their vaccine schedules were completely disrupted. So we need.
And it's the compassion. And this is where the real shame is, because Dr. Joffe does not take the position of, these fucking idiots, they're just not getting vaccinated. He doesn't do that at all. He recognizes that there are very human, very real reasons why people maybe haven't been able to keep up on the vaccination schedule. He makes it also very clear that there were plans there that were identified a year ago to say, how do we deal with this? And you can't help but wonder why it was those plans weren't executed on. Or do you? But there's another clip that I want to play because I think it, again, sums up the problems, one of the many problems that the COVID pandemic left with people. And how one of those problems is we have a class of politicians that are complete cowards and aren't capable of providing any kind of leadership because they're too engrossed in populism. They're too worried about what their personal stakes are as opposed to what the greater good is, that they can't even see their own rank hypocrisy. And I'm saying it in a much more direct way than what you're about to hear.
Let's talk about something controversial. What about mandatory vaccine for school entry in Alberta?
Well, in most U.S. states, almost every U.S. states, so the question was about mandatory immunization prior to school entry. So what we do currently is there is actually a vaccine review at school entry. So kids are picked up who have not been immunized, and for all kinds of reasons. The parents did not want immunization. In others, they just never got around to it. And so we actually can update immunization. Most U.S. states, in fact, it came about, I think, because of the Disneyland outbreak some years ago. Most U.S. states implemented a mandatory requirement for immunization prior to school entry. Challenge with that is there are ways to get around it and increasing ways to get around it. But fundamentally, I would totally support that. Now, that's not going to fly politically. We are not going to make anything mandatory, although it does make me wonder about the what's the Compassionate Act, Monty? So we can force people to take treatment for their addictions, but we are absolutely not going to talk about.
And there it is. There's the ball game. It's about control. It's all about control. With this government, with Danielle Smith, we've seen multiple politicians step forward and talk about the consolidation of power. We've seen political scientists talk about how everything that Danielle Smith and the UCP have done since coming to power, under Danielle Smith in particularly, Kenny did it too, but he was a little bit less aggressive about it, has all been about the consolidation of power. And the consolidation of power happens to increase control. Danielle Smith does not want to piss off her base by doing something that is in the best interest of children. That's not opinion. That's established scientific fact. And again, it wouldn't be forcing people to get vaccinated. If somebody chose to do their homeschooling or whatever the case may be, there's ways. Dr. Jaffe talked about it. There's ways people get around it. And if somebody desperately does not want to acknowledge the science, not want to acknowledge reality, there's ways for them to do that. But for the rest of people, that is an incredibly effective way to meet them where they are. And it is unbelievably hypocritical and incredibly revealing that Danielle Smith and the UCP will put forth legislation that mandates that people can be taken against their will. People who are almost all universally dealing with pre-existing trauma can be taken against their will, further traumatizing them and being forced into a treatment modality that all of the evidence says is not effective, puts people at greater risk of death. But that's okay, because that way we have them under control. But we can't do that when it comes to public health. And it all comes down to how we view the people. We don't look as addicts as possessing the same basic humanity that a kid does. They don't deserve the same rights. They've made bad choices. There's all kinds of bullshit excuses that we can spin for ourselves in order to take away a person's charter rights, in order to traumatize that person. Mandatory vaccinations for school would not take away anybody's charter rights because there are other options that are available, but it would make sure that the conversations were at least happening. It would make sure that instead of it being framed as, oh, it's the big bad thing, it's the evidence-based thing. And that's what it comes down to. This government does not believe in evidence. They don't believe in those things. They believe in the things that make them feel like they're in control. The facts be damned. And Dr. Joffe was very, very clear. Politically, it's not going to happen. That is a matter of will. That's all. Speaking for myself and not any employer, I've said it before and I'll say it in the past. I've said it in the past. I'll say it again. I'm going to say it right now. Danielle Smith has already demonstrated that political will can affect major change. She was able to do it with EMS hallway waits. For a brief period of time, those were put to an end because Danielle Smith said, you know what? That's not going to be a thing that happens anymore. Danielle Smith has demonstrated that she can use political will in order to create the Compassionate Care Act, which is forcing people to accept treatment that is almost unquestionably going to cause them further harm. She's demonstrated that political will can tear apart an integrated healthcare system that was rated the 5th best in the world. Will is what it comes down to. And in order for Danielle Smith and her policies to be stopped and to be addressed, it is going to require acts of will. It is going to require more than complacency and more than the bare minimum. It is going to require dramatic acts of will. It's going to require courage, which brings us to our next segment, because we're going to continue as we carefully read from legal documents in order to not actually say anything. We're going to continue our exploration of the legal situation, the lawsuit that former AHS CEO Athena has initiated against the government of Alberta and the Minister of Health, alleging wrongful termination. And on our last live episode, I think it would have been now, I mean, this is 7.16, so I'm going to say if you want to hear the whole thing, go back to 7.13, the last live roundup that we did. We went through Athena Mentzelopoulos' statement of claim and all of the things that she alleged in her statement of claim, which haven't been proven in a court of law. We went through a bunch of those. Today, we're going to go through the government's response. Next live show, we're going to go through her response to the government's response, and hopefully we'll have a bit more to talk about then as well as the situation progresses. So welcome to Storytime with Nate, where I'm going to read a bunch of things that are important because they haven't been tested in a court of law. On one hand, we have Athena Mentzelopoulos, who has said, I found all of these things that were very, very concerning and very, very scary, and they should be looked into. Now, again, her allegations have not been proven or tested in a court of law. The next step was the Alberta government providing their statement of defense. Also worth noting, none of the things that are in the statement of defense have been tested or proven in a court of law. And the rhetoric and the language that appears in the government statement of defense is, some have called incendiary. So it's worth going through. So here we go. From the government statement of defense, the plaintiff weaves a story that she had uncovered much impropriety in the procurement practices of AHS, an entity that she was hired to lead, but fails to disclose the basic fact that the independent investigators she had hired and which had investigated for months failed to uncovering any wrongdoing during her tenure. Some fascinating phrasing going on there, because it didn't say, and they were done. They didn't find anything. It just says, while she was there, they didn't find anything that was clear. not proven in a court of law. The plaintiff also fails to disclose that even when directed by the minister to report on the conclusions of her investigations in December of 2024, the plaintiff had nothing concrete, but had become so infatuated, which is not a strong word at all, with her investigation and various suspicions that she failed to do her job in carrying out the direction of the province to implement the health system refocus created to bring cost savings and increased access to healthcare within Alberta. And this is where I'm going to jump in and editorialize for a quick sec, because many of the things that appeared in the former CEO's statement of claim referenced chartered surgical facilities. I'm not going to name any specific ones at this moment, but you can go back and listen to the episode if you want me to read the statement of claim. But she talked about chartered surgical facilities. I would love to take a second to direct anybody who's interested to the episode that we did just last week on what a catastrophic failure chartered surgical facilities have been, not only in producing the results that they're supposed to produce for the vast majority of the types of procedures. They do very well for eyes, apparently, but the rest of it's a bit of a train wreck. But those same chartered surgical facilities actually cause harm to the public health system. So one can imagine a scenario where somebody who's responsible for making sure that healthcare is delivered properly in a cost-effective manner might look at a delivery model that is flawed and go, I don't know if we should necessarily be stamping on the gas on that. I'm just saying that's a possibility. It's something could imagine. But continuing on. In the end, the plaintiff was fired because she couldn't do her job, despite having been given the many opportunities to do so. Her termination had nothing to do with any meeting she had scheduled with the Auditor General, which was information the plaintiff had not disclosed to anyone in the province at the time the decision was made to terminate her employment on December 23rd, 2024. Again, I have to... I'm going to make my lawyer so angry tonight. Wording is key in all of these things. So the plaintiff had not disclosed to anyone at the province that the decision was made that she was going to be talking to the Auditor General. That is not a statement that says that the province was unaware of the meeting with the Auditor General. It just says that the former CEO didn't tell them about it. Two totally different things, for the record. The plaintiff, jumped all over the place there. The plaintiff received express direction about the importance of the health system refocus and the mandate of the government to move promptly to implement the changes required to enhance the delivery of health services in Alberta. The province provided extensive support and guidance to AHS in general and the plaintiff in particular to try to complete the health system refocus on time and on budget. In what seemed to be an effort to protect her own personal authority and status, the plaintiff refused to participate in the strategic policy initiative and instead took steps to hinder the efforts being made by the province to optimize the delivery of healthcare in Alberta through the health system refocus. The plaintiff failed to communicate the importance of the health system refocus within the administration of AHS and failed to look for administrative efficiencies. Instead, the plaintiff prioritized efforts to try to nickel and dime frontline care provided by AHS by coming up with, for example, plans to close rural healthcare facilities, eliminate the mobile breast cancer screening program, or lay off nursing staff. So, again, the argument seems to be the province said, this is what we want you to do. I mean, it literally says that the efforts being made by the province. So the province is telling the CEO, here's what we want you to do. And a big part of that was the chartered surgical facilities. And the plaintiff, the former CEO, wasn't delivering on that. Moving on. The plaintiff's allegations against the province have no legal bearing on the elements of the plaintiff's employment claim against Alberta Health Services. They are an improper effort on the part of the plaintiff to try to embarrass various individual public servants in the province by raising incendiary and inaccurate allegations of political intrigue and impropriety. The plaintiff has done this for personal gain. The contractual termination pay she bargained for, which was what she would have been paid if everything had gone according to the contract, $583,443 was not enough. So she's presented a dramatic tale and false narrative of political persecution, presumably to try and pressure AHS to offer more than she is contractually entitled to and deflect deflection away from her own inadequate performance while on the job, the details of which are set out below. Now, this is where, again, I find myself, and I think most reasonable people would suppose, we have Dr. Jaffe, who, by his statements, despite the fact that it appears that he left, he resigned. That seems to be what happened. There's certainly media reporting that says that he resigned. There appears to be some sort of legal shackles that might exist. And presumably, if one was going to get the payout that section just referred to, there may be some legal shackles that would potentially be applied. That's pure speculation on my part. Do with it what you will. Moving on from there. The plaintiff suggests that there are various ministerial orders or directions that were issued to interfere with her investigation. This is simply false. A variety of orders and directions were made during the plaintiff's time as president and CEO of AHS, but these related to the implementation of the health system refocus. The plaintiff was infatuated with her investigation, which failed to uncover any evidence of wrongdoing, and was dragging her heels in implementing the various changes required, presumably because she was opposed to this health system refocus, which would reduce the size of her organization and her own personal prestige. The effects and orders and directives was to move forward with transferring clinical services and oversight from AHS to new entities established by the health system refocus, namely acute care, primary care, assisted living Alberta, and recovery Alberta, the sector entities. This process was continually resisted by the plaintiff, who was either unable or unwilling to carry out the mandate imposed by the province to decentralize care away from AHS. And this is where it gets confusing, because the argument seems to be that she didn't want to have her fiefdom of AHS diminished, but she was hired at a time where that die had already been cast. So, okay, moving on. As a result of the plaintiff's failure or unwillingness to carry out her core responsibilities as president and CEO in December of 2024, the province had to reassign a number of other senior administrators from Alberta Health Services to AHS to do the work that the plaintiff was supposed to be doing. These performance issues had nothing to do with CSF's or investigation into AHS's historical procurement practices. Confidence was lost in the plaintiff's ability to do the job she was hired to do in the time provided to complete the health system refocus, a central policy initiative of the province. She became obsessed and infatuated with her investigation, scare quotes, an investigation, and suspicions about potential impropriety in the procurement field, which her own independent investigators had advised were likely unfounded and that had no concrete evidence of any wrongdoing could be found. The plaintiff's failure to exhibit the skills necessary to work with others and advance the policy initiatives of the province that AHS were directed to follow are why confidence was lost in her abilities and her employment ultimately ended. So again, we've got the argument, oh no, this lawsuit's totally unfounded because she's suing the government, and the government didn't have anything to do with her contract, but the government was mandating how she executed the role. Okay. Moving on. The procurement and CSF investigations. The plaintiff now seeks to deflect attention away from performance and professionalism concerns by raising allegations about the propriety of various historical procurement activities undertaken by AHS, many of which were undertaken before the minister was even appointed. In many ways, the plaintiff conflates and obfuscates the timing of these procurement activities, presumably to create the impression of wrongdoing and spin a web of innuendo and intrigue. There are several procurement activities referenced in the statement of claim. A procurement for children's pain medication, which was conducted by AHS in December of 22, resulting in an agreement with MH Care, an agreement with Alberta Surgical Group to provide orthopedic surgical facilities in Edmonton. The agreement was entered in by AHS in November of 2022. Lots going on in November. An RFP process carried out by AHS for the supply of orthopedic surgical services by CSF in Red Deer. The RFP was issued by AHS on September 7th, 2022 and closed on October 13th, 2022. An RFP process carried out by AHS for the supply of orthopedic surgical services by CSF Chartered Surgical Facility by Lethbridge. This RFP was also issued by AHS on September 7th, 2022 and closed on October 13th. And then we get into the medication. The medication procurement arose in late 2022 during a nationwide supply shortage of infant and children and pain and fever medication, ibuprofen and acetaminophen. This shortage arose because of unprecedented demand that could not be met by existing manufacturers. This was a significant public health crisis of concern to Canadians generally and to many Albertans. The province took prompt action by issuing a direction to AHS on December 1st, 2022, requiring AHS to procure this important medication for Albertans on an expedited basis. The procurement itself, including the selection and the proponent of the concern, and the commercial terms of any agreement with the proponent was all completed by AHS. Contrary to the narrative in her claim, this was not an ongoing procurement when the plaintiff was employed by AHS. Further, while the claim makes various references to amounts AHS has historically paid to MH Care, more than 99.99% of all payments made by AHS to MH Care were made before 2024. Procurement with MH Care was not an active issue at the time the plaintiff was employed by AHS. And we're going to throw another editorial note in here because that's kind of technically true, but kind of also not. And the also not part is, as was reported in the Globe and Mail after we did our little FOIP that came up with some fascinating PO payments, it turns out that AHS paid all the money for the children's medication and had not received something to the effect of $49 million worth of product. And that's ongoing still. So while it's true that the payments were made by and large prior to the Athena Mentzelopoulos taking on the role of CEO of AHS, the details of getting what was paid for was very, very much still in play. And when you're talking about the better part of $50 million that has yet to be received anything for, that certainly would seem to be like the kind of thing a competent CEO might pay attention to. I'm no competent CEO, but that's just my best guess. In July of 2021, AHS issued an RFP for the provision of orthopedic surgery services in Edmonton. ASG was one of the proponents who responded to this RFP, but in fact was not the successful proponent. The successful proponent continues to be actively engaged in contract negotiations with AHS. However, AHS's preferred proponent did not have a surgical facility built at the time of its selection. At the time, ASG had a brand new surgical facility in Edmonton. As a result, and in order to increase surgical capacity and reduce wait times, a short-term agreement to provide increased surgical capacity while the winner of the RFP built out a new facility was negotiated by AHS. This agreement was executed between ASG and AHS on November 1st, 2022 for a 2-year term expiring on November 1st, 2024. The prices negotiated by AHS in relation to the contract reflected the reality that this contract was for a much shorter term than what had been awarded in the RFP process. That's fascinating. So ASG wasn't the first choice. The decision was made to go with a different group, but the different group couldn't provide the services. So then they went with ASG, which, like, I don't know. If I was gonna say, hey, I want to build a garage, and I go through a list of contractors who are going to build the garage, and I say, can you build a garage? And they say, oh, we have the skills to build the garage. We just don't have the tools or the wood or the nails or the garage doors or any of that stuff, but we could totally do it. And I don't know why I would choose them to do that job. But again, I'm not a CEO. So by August of 2024, AHS's preferred proponent was still not ready to begin operations, but AHS, led by the plaintiff, had not yet secured any extension of a short-term agreement with ASG, nor had AHS developed an alternative plan by which it could provide the surgical capacity then being provided by ASG. So again, the crux of the argument appears to be, and I'm no lawyer, but the crux of the argument appears to be we have to have the chartered surgical facilities because they're so great. But the evidence is that they're not. So there's conflict here. And it might not be purely ideological. It could be that a competent CEO was looking at the return on investment and going, well, that's not great. Maybe that's not the thing that we should be pursuing. I don't know. Instead, the plaintiff got into a dispute with ASG about which surgical cases were being referred to ASG. And this is where we get into the allegations that came up in our last episode of some chartered surgical facilities are cherry picking, allegedly, which patients they're taking. So they're only getting the easiest, so they're able to crank them up fastest. The plaintiff became fixated on her interpretation of what ASG's contract with AHS meant and cost comparisons between surgeries undertaken by AHS and those by ASG, which were misguided, ignoring the hundreds of surgeries which had been booked and which would be jeopardized if the agreement was not extended. The plaintiff refused to engage in further dialogue with ASG about a contract that AHS itself had negotiated and left the question of how care would be provided to patients unresolved. And I'm no expert. I'm just going to keep saying that. And I'm no big deal healthcare person. I'm just going to keep saying that. But we have talked on this show many times about how for, I think it was $250,000 a year, the surgical facility that is part of the big Edmonton hospital, you know, that surgical facility that was built and designed to do orthopedic surgeries, the one that hasn't been operating at full capacity because the government has said that they're not going to put forward the $250,000 that would make sure that it ran 24/7 so that people could have quick and easy access to surgical procedures, orthopedic surgical facilities. That one hasn't been running. I don't know what made me think of that. It was just a random thing that popped into my head that's in no way relevant to what I just read. To mitigate the obvious adverse effects on patients, the province, without even having been provided the conclusions of the plaintiff's independent investigator advising the proper rules had been followed, intervened. So the province intervened. And it expedited the removal of the contract with ASG from AHS's oversight. As part of the healthcare system refocus, Acute Care Alberta, rather than AHS, would ultimately be the holder of all contracts with CSFs in the province. This would not have been required if AHS, under the plaintiff's leadership, had effectively addressed either the renewal itself or implemented some alternative means of delivering the care that ASG was providing. Even still, the plaintiff dragged her feet, and the contract extension was not executed until well after 3 p.m. on the day of the expiry. Oh, what's this? How did this get here? That's not supposed to be there. That's the letter from saying that the Auditor General wasn't allowed to talk to anyone directly, and that anybody who wanted to talk to the Auditor General had to go through government lawyers. And that's the letter that the Auditor General later found expressed shock and dismay that it existed, because that's not how things are supposed to happen. I don't know how that ended up in this slide deck. That's so weird. I apologize. On December 23rd, 2024, at a meeting between the Minister, Deputy Minister, and AHS Board Chair Angela Fong, the Minister expressed her concern that there had been a loss of confidence in the plaintiff's ability to carry out her duties in an effective manner in support for the healthcare system refocus. Termination of the plaintiff was discussed, and the termination process was supported by Ms. Fong as chair of the AHS Board. For compassionate reasons, the termination of the plaintiff was deferred until after the Christmas holidays to January 8th, and at Ms. Fong's suggestion to provide sufficient time for AHS's legal counsel to prepare a termination letter and related paperwork. The plaintiff had not told anyone at the province that she had a January 10th, 2025 meeting with the Auditor General at the time the decision was made on December 23rd, 2024 to terminate her position as President and CEO of AHS. So it appears a reasonable person could interpret that the health minister had a direct hand in the conversation to terminate the CEO. It's all so confusing. But okay. The plaintiff then goes on to express concern about the pressure from Mr. Smith in June, and that's Marshall Smith, in June of 2020, allegedly in June of 2024, in relation to the services being provided by ASG. As set out above, at the time, AHS had no plan to be able to replace the surgical capacity that was being provided by ASG. Given the potential adverse effects for Albertans, Mr. Smith did contact the plaintiff, which would not in any way be unusual. So the chief of staff of the premier regularly deals with people that aren't technically his employee. Cool. To inquire about the issue. Contrary to the innuendo and accusations against Mr. Smith, also being pressured, The plaintiff provided Mr. Smith with an explanation that ASG's contract was then set to end on October 31st, 2024, as well as some details about ASG's performance, to which Mr. Smith expressed no pressure whatsoever. In fact, he simply replied to the plaintiff on June 5th, 2024, saying, "Okay, I'm good." And this is where I get confused again. I'm struggling tonight. I apologize. This is all on me. But the chief of staff to the premier listened to the concerns that the CEO had and said, "Okay, I'm good," but somehow her performance was not good. Okay. The plaintiff was not employed by the province, and therefore there was no breach of contract between the plaintiff and the province, as no such contract existed. A contract that does not exist cannot be breached. The plaintiff was employed by AHS, who provided the plaintiff with adequate notice or pay in lieu of notice of the termination of her employment, all in accordance with the agreement that she negotiated with the advice of counsel. The plaintiff is not entitled to any further compensation, benefits, or other payments arising from the conclusion of her employment. Filing her statement of claim with allegations of political intrigue and half-truths does not change that. As there has been no breach of the plaintiff's employment agreement, there can be no cause of action to induce a breach of that contract. And that brings us to, but her emails. You can always go back to that. Because it was not very long after that statement of claim was filed that the province said, also, we found out that she had forwarded herself some emails while she was still the CEO. And she was in control of those records, and she wasn't supposed to do that. So yeah, that's why we fired her. And that is some next level retconning, because nowhere did they claim up until the discovery of the not the discovery, but the statements of claim were all filed, that they knew that she had done this thing, so they couldn't have used that as a decision to fire her. And at best, they're saying that retroactively, if they had known, they would have used it as a decision to fire her. But it's all very, very confusing. And we're going to talk next week about the injunction that the province tried to get and was successful in some part of getting, in regards to ensuring that the emails were not shared outside of the legal proceedings. And to be clear, Athena Metsalopoulos was her lawyer was very clear that those emails had not been shared. They had not been disseminated. There was no security breach that occurred. So we're going to talk about that piece in greater detail to make sure that we get everything right about it next week. But we got a couple other things. Just a couple other things that we got to talk about real quick, because I promised, much to, I'm sure, some of your horror, that we were going to spend a little bit of time talking about a certain David Parker, because David Parker is not done yet. He's not gone away. He took a good chunk of time off of the socials for Lent. He gave up Twitter for Lent, as Jesus would. And he's used that time wisely. He's used that time to organize in pretty impressive ways in regards to taking over school boards across the province. And he's been very, very clear. That's been his goal for a good long time, to make sure that Take Back Alberta, if not in name, but in essence, has a direct hand in ensuring who's going to be involved with school boards in the upcoming round of municipal elections across the province. And he's also done some speaking gigs, apparently. He did one just recently where he shared his views on Canada.
There is no way that Canada can be saved. We have brought in so many immigrants, and we have diluted our values to such a high degree that we don't even know what the nation of Canada is anymore. Go to Brampton, go to Surrey, go to Edmonton and Calgary right now. You will not recognize the place that you are in. We're not bringing in the world's best and brightest, folks. We did. Under Stephen Harper, I worked in his government. We had very high standards for bringing people in, and we were bringing in great immigrants who were contributing to our economy. We are now bringing in people who cost the Canadian taxpayer an average of $3,500 a month, which is more than our elderly get from OAS and CPP combined on average. We are right now a hotel for the world's welfare cases. Our productivity has not gone up in the last decade. That means we've brought in 4 million people and see no increase in productivity. But it gets worse. We haven't seen any GDP growth. I think it's over the last 10 years, 0.97. When you account for things like inflation and immigration, we have seen a decrease in our quality of life over the last decade, and it's only going to get worse. So do I think Canada can be saved? Absolutely not. Not only do I not think that it can be saved, I think that if we try to save it, it will be just like, those horrible, tragic stories where someone swims out to help their drowning friend and they both die together. It's time to leave. And if we don't get out now, then I suggest getting out, because you're not going to want to live in the place.
Now, it wouldn't be David Parker if a lot of that wasn't true. And rest assured, a lot of that isn't true. You can go to the Google machine and you can ask, is Canada's GDP growing? And the Google machine will tell you that Canada's real GDP grew 2.1% in Q2 2024. That was after rising 1.8% in Q1 2024. So and this is the problem. There's no question that economically things aren't as good as we would like them to be. There's no question that the world has become a destabilized place, largely in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Donald Trump pandemic. There's no question that things aren't as good as we would all like them to be. There's no question that housing prices have placed home ownership out of the reach for far too many people. There's no question that cost of food, cost of living continues to go up. But the reasons for all of those things are far more complex and far more nuanced than it's the darn immigrants. It's simply not true. And it's a lazy way to try to approach a economic problem that is not isolated only to Canada. It's just racist. That's all it is. It's lazy racism. And it's a predictable form of lazy racism, because there were many people when David Parker was going out of his way to be involved in the anti-trans policies and spreading lies about children getting their genitalia chopped off, which never happened in Canada. He was very, very quick to bring in other groups. He made a big production about having his Muslim friends and his Sikh friends come out to his rallies. It's almost as if there's a theme that occurs where when someone or something is politically expedient, then they're to be considered an ally. And when you're done with them, they're disposable. And that's not the kind of leadership that anyone should be looking for. And for the folks in Take Back Alberta, the question that they should be asking themselves is, if David Parker is willing to throw huge swaths of Canadians under the bus, what makes you think you're safe? We got two other little sort of what moments that we want to share for Alberta Politics, and then we're gonna call it a night. The first one comes compliments of a name that's well known to Alberta Politics. We're talking now about Cam Davies, and if you're unfamiliar with Mr. Davies, you should Google him. It gets fascinating real quick. But Mr. Davies made an announcement on the Twitter machine that made some waves, and this is again one of those areas where it's worth thinking about what Danielle Smith is doing to her base, because Cam Davies released a lecture where he declared that he was not going to, he was giving up his UCP membership. From the letter, I was a proud member of the Wild Rose Party before Daniel Smith crossed the floor. I chose to stay behind, rebuild, and help lead the party to 21 seats in the 2015 election, securing official opposition status. I supported the merger that formed the UCP because I believed Albertans needed a united, principled, and accountable conservative movement. What we got instead is a party that preaches conservative values but governs like the very establishment it once vowed to replace. The UCP has become bloated, dishonest, and corrupted by entitlement. It is addicted to power and allergic to transparency. We are not witnessing leadership. We are witnessing damage control. Backroom deals, gag orders, and purges of internal dissent have replaced open dialogue and democratic decision-making. MLAs are muzzled, caucus is sidelined, staff are silenced, and the grassroots member who built this movement have been abandoned. Some very strong words from Mr. Davies. And again, it's worth remembering that when we're talking about people like Cam Davies, people like Pete Guthrie, they're nothing if not consistent. They are who they are. And while many of their policy beliefs, a lot of people would find abhorrent, they're consistent. Now, Mr. Davies has reportedly gone on to be part of the formation of the Republican Party of Alberta, Alberta Republican Party, the I Wish I Was American Party, the Please Just Move Party. That's my name for them. But it's not nothing. Because we're talking about people who have significant reputational cachet in the conservative movement. And this is the problem that the UCP chose to address. This is what Kenny struggled with and ultimately what took Kenny apart. The thing that is conservatism is broad. In the same way that the thing that is progressivism is broad. But the thing that is conservatism is very, very, very broad. To call somebody from the Wild Rose circa 2012 a conservative is to speak of a very different kind of conservative than to speak of somebody who was in the progressive conservative party. And to say that somebody in the pro-life movement or the forced birther movement is a conservative is valid. But all of these different flavors of conservatism, instead of having their own little jam that they were doing with the majority of Albertans aligning with the former progressive conservative movement up until they got way too entitled and did dumb stuff, the fringes have always been there, and they're very, very difficult to control. They're the most passionate. They're the ones who get the most done, but they're very, very difficult to control. Jason Kenney could not do it. He lost them, and it cost him his premiership. Daniel Smith rode to power on only them. When Jason Kenney came into power in the province of Alberta, he did so talking about uniting conservatism to defeat the evil menace of the NDP. And he said to all of the conservatives, hey, we've all got to get on the same page here because, gosh, the NDP, just the worst. Oh my gosh, we just have to stop the NDP because they're so bad. And people bought it. And so they lined up and they said, you know what, I wouldn't hang out with you at a party, and we're not going to go for drinks anytime soon, but sure, let's do this thing so that we can stop the very evil NDP. Jason Kenney brought a coalition. Daniel Smith brought the fringes. And at that point in time, the old school moderate conservatives had been so alienated by the behavior that they had seen from the UCP that they just didn't really show up all that much. But all of the fringes absolutely did. And it's the fringes that are starting to turn on Daniel Smith. It's the Cam Davies. It's the David Parkers. And even the more less fringy, the Pete Guthries. They're all starting to say, wait a second, I think you might have lied to me. I think maybe you pretended to be something that you're not. I think maybe you used me in order to get fancy vacations so you could hang out with your favorite American podcasters and media influences. I think maybe you played me a little bit, Danny. And if that sentiment starts to spread, Danielle Smith is going to be in a whole world of hurt. And there seem to already be a few folks that are starting to soften the ground a little bit. And this is where we're going to end with something funny. Because Brian. Brian Jean. Brian Jean tweeted this out for reasons that defy understanding. And we're gonna go to the full screen version of that. It's very confusing for a long list of reasons. See, what he's done is he's made a couple of slogans. He's got a couple of slogans here that say, "Let's make Alberta the happiest, the healthiest, the most free, and most prosperous." And then it's not UCP, it's brianjean.ca. And there's no beard, which, Brian's running around with his beard these days. He's got the big Stinky Pete beard. And I'm almost a little bit disappointed that the beard didn't make its way into the word picture. I don't know what to call it other than perhaps 6th grade art. But serious people running the province, serious people who are exempting coal mines from the standards. It's all very fine. We're coming up to the 2-hour mark, so we're going to put a pin in it for tonight. We're actually, one of the things that we're toying with here at the Breakdown is, I know that there's a lot of people who want to do the open mic things, but the problem is that the dumpster fires are burning so hot and so furious right now that for us to be able to hit on the things that we want to hit on and talk about the things that we want to hit on, we keep having these ridiculous 2-hour episodes. And so, that leaves absolutely no time for the open mics, the speakers corners. And so we're going to look at perhaps doing a designated night every 2 weeks where we're going to have those open mic speakers corners. Let us know what you think. If you like the idea, throw it in the comments, send us a DM. And this is where I'm going to get to all of the plugs of the things and the stuff, because we do have some bills that we have to pay. We did file a couple more FOIPs this week, and I'm gonna say the stuff that I know I'm plugging the coal mine stuff, but it's so breathtakingly stupid. I'll share this little anecdote before I do all the plugs for all the things, and then because I do want to get people a little bit excited for what we're going to be talking about. I was standing on the side of the highway, having discovered and been instructed by our tour guides as to some of the things that were going on. And we all stumbled across this one little new nugget of information. And I just laughed because it was so egregious. And as much as Danny and the UCP love to invoke the spirit of Ralph Klein, between my laughter, I was 100% confident that there is no universe in which Ralph Klein would be supporting the shenanigans, the fuckery that is going on in the Grassy Mountain. So it's going to take us a couple of weeks to put that whole package together. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have some fun with it. Think about our True North episode where we had the special segment. We're doing something like that. It's going to be worth the wait, I promise. But all of that being said, one of the reasons why we're able to do all of those things that we're able to do and go down to the Crow's Nest Pass and do a bunch of photos and videos and stuff is because of the support that we get from our Patreon supporters. So the show here, we don't do any advertising, and we don't take any government funding whatsoever. That's an inside baseball joke that a few people will hopefully get. We're able to do all the things that we do because of the support that we get from our audience, and that's it. So if you value the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, we'd love nothing more if you thought about being one of our supporters at our Patreon site at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where you can really set the price of your monthly commitment. But every little bit helps us be able to take on some of these ridiculous things that we do, whether it's the filing the FOIPs, whether it's driving down to the Crow's Nest Pass and running around dusty roads and getting pictures of coal mines and empty reservoirs and all that kind of stuff. It all happens because of the support that we get from our patrons and sponsors. So if you're able to sign up to be one of our patrons and sponsors, you can do that at, again, www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab. Now, we also understand that some people, they're just not into the monthly commitment shtick, and that's cool too. But if you want to support us still and you haven't the fortitude or the desire for a long-term commitment, then you can also send e-transfers to info@thebreakdownab.ca. That's cool too. Any support is great. The other thing that I will just add is the first batch of these bad boys is in the mail. We're giving these away for free. You only have to send for postage. And so for $5, if you want, you can send $5 to that same email address. Now I'm just getting punchy. You can send $5 to that same email address and we'll send you 2 of these bumper stickers so that when you travel Canada this summer, people will know when they look at your Alberta license plate that you are in fact a Canadian first. So there's that little bit of housekeeping. A couple other things I want to say, and then we're going to wrap it up for the night. I want to say a big thank you to everybody that's been listening, whether you're in the chat on the YouTubes and the Facebooks, or you're listening on the Twitter Spaces, and it will always be Twitter to me. Thank you so much for choosing to spend a little bit of time with us on your Sunday evening. And I want to be really clear with everybody. It does matter who you vote for. And I certainly have my preference. I would encourage everybody to take a look at some of the websites. If you haven't voted already, you're waiting for tomorrow, take a look at some of the websites that exist out there. There's the smart voting one that takes a look at all of the recent polling for the riding that you live in. And it tells you who you should vote for if you want to see your preferred party who has the best chance of winning, who you can vote for. But do vote. If you're able to, please do vote. It is an incredible privilege that we have in the country that we live in, that we are able to overthrow our government in a peaceful coup every few years. That is a luxury that many countries simply do not have access to. There are many countries that do not have the ability for people to go out and make their voices heard. And yes, I get the choices are not always the best. And yes, there's no party that perfectly represents or really comes super close to representing what I would like to see for Canada. There's many things that I would fix if I had my druthers, but the alternatives in many cases are catastrophically worse. So no matter what you do tomorrow, find the time to, if you haven't already, get down to a polling station and make sure that you vote, because it's so critically important, and it is such a privilege. And if it's one that if you do not exercise, history has taught us you have pretty good odds of losing. So go do your civic duty. It is quite literally the bare minimum that any participant in a democracy can do. So there's that. It promises to be a bonkers week, because we've got the election tomorrow. We'll get the results. People will lose their minds one way or the other. Apparently, Alberta, there's going to be some sort of separatism rally that happens shortly after the election if the Liberals win, which is dumb. It's just stupid, and it's embarrassing. But that being said, it's going to be bonkers in the province of Alberta, and Danny's going to be off of her self-imposed exile to the Japan, and I think she went to Korea too. Also paid for by taxpayers. Not sure who went with her. Gonna have to file a FOIP on that. But there's all of that stuff. So thank you everybody for tuning in. If you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, please throw a review in there, because those do help get the podcast in front of more ears. If you're watching it, smash that like and subscribe button. You can put the little bell on, and then when we do all the little shorts, then you get notified that we put up a short, and it's a much more concise version than what you're listening to right now. All of that being said, I got one last clip I got to play for you, because we need a little levity.
How's your BS detector evolved over time?
I tend to be pretty trusting.
I will never, ever get tired of that clip. She's going to lose her leadership at some point. Danielle Smith will no longer be the premier of Alberta at some point. And I'm still going to be here 2 years after that date going like, but look at the second nod, because it's so good. Thank you so much, everybody. Vote tomorrow. Tell Donald Trump, pound sand. Burnt the White House down once. We'll do it again if we have to. We're very, very nice, but you don't want to see us angry. And in the meantime, and in between time, before we get our open mics sorted out, and before we get our next episode next week, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and now more than ever, keep the conversation going.
Thank you.